Patriarchy is a very old cultural system, social cultural system that favors men above women and other genders. And it's been around for thousands of years. In fact, there's a lot of debate in academic circles about when it started and why it started. And there are a lot of different theories. But we know for sure that ever since we've had written language, we have had patriarchy because there have been words for dowry, for example, and bride servant, or whatever, words that orient us to, especially in the Indo-European languages, oh, this was a male-dominated society even before the Greeks and before the Romans potentially. And then definitely by the time we got to the Greeks and Romans, we definitely had patriarchy in place.
Welcome to Latinx in Power, a podcast hosted by Thaisa Fernandes.
Welcome to Latinx in Power. Today we are talking with Majo Molfino. Majo is a Latinx author, designer, and woman leadership expert. She is the author of Break the Good Girl Myth and host of the HEROINE podcast, featuring top female leaders, creatives, and visionaries. She has a master's in learning, design, and technology from Stanford University and a bachelor degree in psychology with a minor in cultural studies from McGill University. Welcome, Majo.
I'm so happy to be here, Thaisa. Thank you for having me.
In this episode, we will discuss more about Majo's book, The Good Girl Myth, where she explores the 5 myths we tend to follow, which are rules, harmony, logic, perfection, and sacrifice. I'm excited with this conversation as I have read Majo's book twice already.
Wow, twice. That's incredible.
And I would like to start with this question. So I'd love to hear from you. What does it mean to be a Latinx?
Well, I'm very proud to be Latinx. I'm Argentinian, so I was born in Buenos Aires and I grew up in North America. So I was an early immigrated early. For me, it's interesting, the label Latinx, I sometimes feel a little mixed about, and I would love your take on it as well. Just because when in Latin America, we don't call ourselves Latinx. We're just whatever country we're from. Like you're Brazilian, I'm Argentinian. But in the US context, we need a word to sort of lump all these countries together and peoples together. And it's a very empowering word on the one hand, but I think it also can erase some of the differences and nuances we have between countries. And I also think that it's a little complicated. Like the other day I learned that Haitians, so people from Haiti, are not considered Latino or Latinx. And it's not even about language because Brazilians are considered Latinx and they speak Portuguese and not Spanish. So you start to see that the label is a little bit random too, even though it's trying to encompass something, it is also a little random. So I have mixed feelings, but I own it. I own it very much. But I like to be specific. I like to say I'm Latinx, and that means I'm Argentinian American. And that feels important. So people also get the specificity.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned that we have been having conversations about it. We actually just spoke with Adi Barreto, and they mentioned the same thing, that the term is kind of to box us, but at the same time, it's important because brings belonging, especially when you're not living in your home country. But at the same time, it removes a lot of specificities that we are there's a lot of countries involved in different language. So there's not only one way to describe all those countries. So yeah, I like that idea of like saying I'm a Latinx, but I'm also from this country or descendant from this country, and being more specific from time to time. I think it's also important.
Definitely. And we're so many, and some people, they have in their mind Latinx means, maybe Mexican, or they have a specific, and what's so amazing and beautiful about is their Latinx encompasses very many races and many ethnicities and many places of origin and languages. It's almost like if all of a sudden we started having a category around Europeans and people started saying like, I'm Euro, I'm Euro.
Yes.
and we'd be like, okay, but from where? Are you German? Are you French? Because it's very different.
Yeah, I love that. And it's interesting because I had the sense of being a Latinx or being a Latina after I moved to the US. And you're right. When I was living in Brazil, I never thought about this that much. And I think it also because of the language and a lot of like the aspects of the Hispanic culture that Brazilians don't have because we were colonized by the Portuguese. And then moving here, we are all part of the same bucket, which is awesome because it brought me a lot of belonging. I could see myself in a lot of people. I could hear similar accents, but at the same time, there's a lot of other aspects that we are different.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And to help us to set the stage, I wanted to ask you, how does the patriarchy manifest inside us women?
It's such a good question. So patriarchy is a very old cultural system, social cultural system that favors men above women and other genders. And it's been around for thousands of years. In fact, there's a lot of debate in academic circles about when it started and why it started. And there are a lot of different theories. But we know for sure that ever since we've had written language, we have had patriarchy because there have been words for dowry, for example, and bride servant or whatever, words that orient us to, especially in the Indo-European languages, oh, this was a male-dominated society even before the Greeks and before the Romans potentially. And then definitely by the time we got to the Greeks and Romans, we definitely had patriarchy in place. That's why I just read this incredible book about female monsters. That's why in the Greek mythology, all these men are just killing all these female monsters and so much more. Then we have, of course, Christianity and the Bible, and that infiltrates all of Western thought and society. And all of that is based on patriarchal thinking. And so it's been around for a long time, which means even though we've had the feminist movement and the women's lib movement in the last, within the last century, we still have a lot of work to do. And not only for women's rights around the world, but like I say in the book, Break the Good Girl Myth, my book, within ourselves as well.
How does being a female Latinx immigrant and daughter of immigrants led you to develop the good girl mentality?
So I'd be curious to hear your experience too, but I came over when I was very young, when I was 2 years old. And there was always this, idealism of the American dream. And we had to work really hard to achieve through education and then climb up the ladder. And so achievement was very important for me in my family's story, particularly with my father who came over and was a doctor. But it was just ingrained in us to be very good at school and get the highest possible education and work at a very steady job and make a steady income. It was from the beginning. So because of that immigrant backdrop, I became a complete good girl. What you can imagine, I was, teachers loved me. I was always wanted to be close to my parents. I wanted to get their approval. I never wanted to disappoint anyone. I got all straight A's and I basically did, I never got in trouble. I did everything that I was told, and that had benefits, but it also it caught up to me after I left the school system.
It's interesting because the first time I read your book, I think I never realized that much how a good girl I am, because especially when I was a teenager, I was really rebellious in a sense that I wanted to question a lot of things that was brought to me. And a lot of them I didn't agree. But at the same time, I'm a rule follower, but I choose the rules I want to follow. And I was always really good at school. For me, it was really important to have good grades and essentially being a good girl, although I was maybe a punk good girl, and we can talk more about the 5 myths. But to me, it was really interesting, the sense that I always thought that being a perfectionist was something amazing because I was always striving for the best, right? And after many, many years, your book helped me a lot realize that, this actually is not good because this might be preventing me to do a lot of things I want to do. And I basically don't do because I'm not perfect at it.
Exactly. I think when we were talking earlier, you mentioned you have a design background. So people who study design or some things like architecture or perfectionism is, think about the Steve Jobs thing. It's like, we want that. We want perfection. We want excellence in our craft. We want to be detail oriented. We we want looks at things with a fine comb, tooth comb and stuff. And I think that there is a place for perfectionism at a certain stage in the creative process. But for most of us, most of the time, perfectionism is actually a block and it's not helpful, especially when you are in the early stages of trying to bring an idea to life or bring an idea into form. If you have a strong inner critic who's telling you, well, it's not good enough, it's too messy, you're going to not even start. And not only will you not even start, but if you do start, you will quit quite early. And there's a lot of research that shows this happens to girls more than boys because they develop what's called a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset, in large part because of the way that they are praised by teachers and parents. So teachers and parents tend to praise little girls for fixed traits, like saying things like, good girl, you're so intelligent, or hyper focus on how they look. You look really pretty or beautiful, blah, blah, blah. So these are seemingly fixed traits. Whereas with boys, we tend to praise them for grit and perseverance and effort. And when you praise a child more for effort, they realize, oh, I can try harder and get better at it. So it's okay if I suck. Whereas if you praise a child for a trait, they think either I'm good at it or I'm not good at it. And this happens to a lot of girls early on, but then it follows us in adulthood and it becomes problematic because it actually stifles our creative confidence. Because in order to have creative confidence, we need to be able to allow ourselves to make mistakes and be messy and suck at things for a period of time. You have to let yourself be terrible and bad at things for a period of time to get good at them. And so you have to survive that period of ugliness. And if we grew up as a good girl, we don't like that. We don't like to be bad at things. We don't like things to look ugly. And that's the thing we have to overcome.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important to talk about it and have this knowledge. And also on top of that, as you mentioned, there's the patriarchy affecting our lives. And we know that the society in general is more forgiving when men does something wrong. When woman does something wrong, we are more judged at all and we get scared. Of course, they will judge us and our lives can be at risk depending on what you do. So it's really scary.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's not just in our heads. I think we do live in a system where there is more backlash and more shaming and more judgment, not just from other men, but from other women too, or other non-binary folks or whoever, when a woman makes a mistake versus when a man makes a mistake. We're so harsh on women and how they look and how they sound, how their voice sounds. And it's because, again, patriarchy and even I don't talk about, and I don't use this word in the book, but what we're really talking about is misogyny, like the hatred of women, which is very deep rooted in our society as well. And I think that's real. And so for someone who's like, well, I'm afraid to make a mistake and say something because every time I do, I'm going to get hosed down or, I'm going to get embarrassed. I think that as women, we have to develop a strength that, unfortunately, we have to develop a strength and a tolerance to that kind of backlash because it's going to happen. And some of the best, most incredible feminist icons and heroines that are really changing the world. I think this quality, the ability to withstand criticism, the ability to withstand backlash, that is the key thing that is allowing them to influence and change the status quo. Like think about Malala, Malala Yousafzai, 15-year-old girl from Swat Valley in Pakistan, and she is literally shot in the head by the Taliban. Can there be anything more severe than that? If you contextualize things, it's like we're talking about maybe you get called out on the internet because you write something. I mean, we're talking about Malala getting practically assassinated, and that woman has talk about the depth of faith and perseverance. I mean, it gives me goosebumps, the ability to withstand that kind of thing and say, no, that's not going to stop me and it's not going to keep me down. So we can learn from that in big and small ways.
And can you describe the 5 myths you identify in your book?
Sure. So there are 5 good girl myths. There's the myth of rules, which is following external rules and authority instead of trusting your own needs, your own opinions. There's the myth of perfection, which is my primary good girl myth. And we touched a little bit upon it. This is when you demand perfection in yourself and reality and other people. You have impossibly high standards. The myth of logic. This is choosing logic over intuition in decision-making and in navigating your life. The myth of harmony, which is a big one I see, it's seeking harmony instead of embracing conflict and confrontation needed for change. And finally, the myth of sacrifice, which is really the oldest good girl myth. So we're still shaking it off. It's putting other people's needs above our own at the expense of our self-care and well-being. And what all these good girl myths are, whether it's rules, perfection, logic, harmony, sacrifice, these are tendencies. They're mostly subconscious. They're very sneaky. Often we don't know that we're falling under the spell of the myth. I like to think of it as a spell, like these myths have a spell over us. And the next thing you know, we're like, whoa, I've been under the spell of the myth of harmony and I'm waking up. And none of these things also, I would say that I feel is important. None of these things are actually wrong, like inherently wrong. There is a moment or context to have harmony. There is a moment and situation in which sacrifice is needed, but are we defaulting into it because it's what we've been programmed to do and we've learned since we were little girls? Or are we choosing it because it's the empowering choice in the moment? And that's the difference. Are you defaulting or are you choosing? And what I want more women to do is I don't want women to throw out logic. I don't want women to throw out harmony. These are good things. We need them. But I want women to choose logic and choose harmony when it is appropriate and when they have the wisdom to discern this is a good moment for me to have sacrifice versus this is not a good moment for me to sacrifice my time and energy because I want to prioritize my own dreams or myself. I think that distinction is important to make.
Yeah, I like that. I like first when you said that we might be under the spell of these myths, meaning that we don't need to follow those myths forever, but we can choose to do it. So I think this is really liberating, and also understanding that there's some periods of our life that we might need to strive for perfection in a specific project or something else. You need to sacrifice for a family member, for example. There's these periods, but ideally we should be able to choose when.
Yeah, we should be conscious versus unconscious because when it's a pattern or a tendency, it is unconscious. We don't know, we don't realize, but then we see consequences in our lives. Like in a myth of harmony, for example, if you're under the spell of the myth of harmony and you're not speaking up and you're not having difficult conversations in your life and you're doing that for years, eventually that's going to have consequences on you. You're going to end up in toxic relationships with people that are taking advantage of you. You're going to end up in situations that you don't want to be in. So it compounds over time. So we have the ability and choice to snap out of it, become awake. Really, it's about waking up. Wake up. Let's get out of this, and choose a different path for ourselves. That's so important.
And thinking about it, do you think about the good girl mentality is different from the good immigrant mentality?
I do. I mean, I definitely think about how these things all intersect. We talk a lot about intersectional feminism and think about how you can certainly be a good girl and have the good girl archetype. And I think it's very universal without being an immigrant for sure. And you can be an immigrant without having the good girl archetype. So there are some of us where it overlaps perfectly. And when these things overlap, they enhance each other. It's like they become stronger, and it becomes its own thing. And so I think that for good girl immigrants or good girl daughters of immigrants, there's a specific flavor of good girl that we have to watch out for. And a lot of it has to do with family and our parents and repaying our parents for their sacrifice and wanting to be the good daughter. So often if you're the eldest daughter as well, that's another enhancer, because you may feel even more responsible for your family and put a lot of responsibility on your shoulders. And so it's been interesting to even talk about how it intersects with Latinx community, and people, because if you're Latinx, maybe you come from a country where religion is very big. I know in my country of origin, Argentina, Catholicism is dominant. And so the narratives and stories that we inherit from Catholicism, that will also intersect with the good girl stuff, right? Stuff around sexuality and desire and sin and what's good and wrong and bad. So you really have to look at your unique situation and think about, what have I inherited and from where? How is that stoking the fire of this good girl archetype? And how can I free myself, create a little more space?
Yeah, absolutely. Since I read your book, I started to think about all those layers, the good girl myth, the good immigrant myth and a lot of others. Being from Brazil, a really religious country, although I'm not Catholic, my family is. And I know how this also influences myself, even though I'm not Catholic, even though I'm not religious. And it's interesting. The same thing with the patriarchy, and being a feminist, but at the same time, how we also need to keep our eyes open and hear other stories to have more awareness also about our blind spots, because we have many, 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 and we need to have those conversations and keep our eyes open all the time.
Yeah, you have to be vigilant. Even the other day, I was like, oh, I'm going to go to the mall or this whatever supermarket. And I was wearing a little tank top. It was a little bit low. And I was like, oh, I better cover myself up and, make sure that I'm not showing too much skin because I'm going to the supermarket. And I'm like, but I was comfortable in my tank top. And I thought, wow, where's that modesty coming from? Oh, yeah. It's like all the messages I got as a little girl, which is, if you're going to church, you're going to school, you're going to this, like cover up, And when I was a little girl, maybe it made sense, especially in family contexts. But now, I can choose. Like, I want to go to the supermarket in a tank top. I can. So I had to catch the thought and the tendency towards modesty and choose something else.
Awareness is the key. And how was the process of writing the Good Girl Myth book? Was always your goal to write a book about it, or your podcast kind of like helped or accelerate this process?
Yeah, the podcast definitely helped me, gave me a platform. And for those who don't know, I have a podcast called HEROINE, where I interview women leaders in creativity, so different visionaries. But I started really focused on design, tech, and business. And then I expanded out into different categories. But all these women have one thing in common, which is risk-taking and walking into the unknown and kind of just being a badass. And I thought, well, some of them had stories where they kind of were good girls early on, and they had to break through it. So I learned from listening to them. And then I learned from listening, in addition to the podcast, to my own coaching clients, many of whom were in Silicon Valley and working in big tech companies. And I noticed these tendencies in them. And then just talking to friends and family. So the Good Girl Myths were emerged in the last 5 years when talking to people and listening and noticing and seeing it in myself. And I thought, I think there's a message here. There's a core message here that is important and interesting. I want to share with the world. And so how do you share a message? There are many vehicles, not just writing a book, but the book was the seed planted in my mind. And then I became very determined to see it to finish. And it was a long journey. It took 3 years from kind of concept out to publication. And it has been amazing to see the response from different women, people emailing me, sending me DMs on Instagram, reading the book, telling me that it has changed or shifted their consciousness. They're becoming more aware, or their mind is being blown, like you said, which I really appreciate. And that's what I wanted. I wanted it to touch women's lives, and I wanted them to create change within themselves. I remember telling my publisher, if I could have a woman read this and feel something, it would not only be more revelation and more insight about themselves, but also activated. Like, okay, now that I know this, like I want to start this thing that I've been delaying, or I'm going to stop making these excuses and start.
That's amazing. And I'm a big reader. I love books in general, and I love to gift my friends with books. So I remember that I gave your book to one of my best friends, and she said to me, my myth is harmony. And then something clicked, and I was like, yes, definitely, definitely. And we could see things in a totally different way. And for her, it was really life-changing. And it's interesting because she's one of my best friends, but it's kind of hard to think about those things if you don't have the framework, right? But when she said to me, and I was like, yes, definitely, your myth is harmony. I can see that in your entire life.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's like having a language or a map for something. And so then you can, now that you have language around it, you can now identify it. after you identify it, you can create some distance between yourself and that tendency. You can start to change and create change. I'm curious, what has she done with that knowledge? Has she been able to notice herself when she's caught in it?
Yeah. We talked about that a lot. And she started to notice the moments where she was striving for harmony rather than having important discussions. So she was first more aware of that, and now she's able to do something about it, which is really life-changing. It's life-changing. It's so important.
Yeah, having difficult conversations is the one thing that if you have the myth of harmony, you avoid at all costs. Like you don't want to have the difficult conversation, but that is so necessary to allowing a relationship to mature or allowing your situation to transform. It's like if you're in a bad work situation, or if you're in a terrible relationship, or you have tension with a friend, in order to bring it to the next level, for it to ameliorate and for it to improve, you need to have the difficult conversation. You have to walk through it. And so in that chapter, I give tools and frameworks on how to do that.
Talking again about all those layers that we have on top of our myths, thinking about being a Latinx, I think it's another layer of this myth, because speaking about myself and my culture, we avoid conflict all the time. And we have this idea that the conflict is bad, it's wrong, so we should avoid. And my personal experience, I actually started to change that when I moved. Not exactly because I am in the United States now, but because I read a book. It's called 5 Dysfunctions of a Teen, and they talk about conflicts. And I realized that the conflict can actually be something good. And the reason why is because we have a chance to talk and discuss different point of views and find a solution, a better solution maybe for both parts, And I think this was the moment that I clicked. And now I feel better about conflicts. But talking about, for example, my Brazilian friends, I can see how they avoid conflict all the time. I was the one doing that for a huge part of my life. So it's interesting to think about that too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Some cultures avoid conflict and some cultures lean into it. I would say in my family, we were okay with conflict. Yeah. I don't know if it's Argentinian because we have more Italian roots, potentially. Who knows? But we could fight. And we could be confrontational. And we know that it was a way to, the feeling is like you could still fight and say what you wanted and what was on your mind, and there would still be unconditional love there. So I grew up watching that and thought, that's interesting. Like I could be safe to say what I want. And I don't know that a lot of people necessarily have that. What they observe is if I say what I want, I'm not safe, and this will sever the relationship. And so it gets tricky.
And in this season, we are asking our guests which resource helped them in their journey. That can be books, podcasts, anything. So I would love to hear from you the resources you recommend.
Sure. So a great follow-up book after getting my book, I hope, Break the Good Girl Myth. There's a really wonderful book that inspired my book. Is called Women Who Run with the Wolves. It's a classic. Have you read it, Thaisa?
I'm reading. It's been a while. I'm reading. I don't know, sometimes I feel that the book chooses us, but I started to read finally, but it's taking me a lot of time, maybe because I'm a fast reader, but this book, it's taking me a lot of time. I was actually talking with a friend yesterday about it, maybe because I'm thinking a lot.
No, it's very dense. So I'm not surprised that it takes a long time. Mm-hmm. It took me a while too. And I think I keep coming back to it. Almost read one chapter, I'll let it sink in. But I ended up doing a training with Clarissa Piccola Estes in Colorado. It was very, very, very impactful. But the reason is, when I think about the good girl archetype, which is what centers the book, there is the opposite archetype, which she gets into in her book, called the wild woman archetype. And it exists across cultures. So I think we want to access that source of power within ourselves as well. And so that book really helped, inspired my writing. And I consider her to be a mentor and teacher. And I have a fun quiz that I think maybe your listeners will like. It's available on my website. If you go to majomolfino.com, you'll see the free quiz there, and you can identify your creative feminine leadership quality. And you take the quiz and it will kind of tell you what is your superpower as a female leader and how can you harness this quality into action steps in your work, in your career, in whatever you want to create for yourself.
That's awesome. Really cool. Yeah, we are going to link in the description of this episode all the links you mentioned so people will have easy access to it. And I'm curious about this quiz. I want to do it.
Yeah, definitely go for it.
Awesome. Yeah, I wanted to thank you so much for your time. Your book is incredible. I also love your podcast. So I think our community will enjoy that a lot. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. That's it for today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. We will have a new episode coming soon. And feel free to follow us in our social media channels and share your thoughts, always with kindness. See you soon.